On the 24th of January 1943, a Hungarian general signed an order. It told 200,000 of his own men that the army had lost its honour. The general was Gusztav Jany. He commanded the Royal Hungarian Second Army. And as he wrote those words, that army was freezing to death in the snow west of the Don. No food, no winter coats, brutal cold that reached 40 below. He was the man who had left them there. He was not the first to fail them, only the loudest. What he chose not to say in that order, and what he would quietly try to take back 3 months later, is the real story here. Start with the ending, because it is the point. The Royal Hungarian Second Army went to the Upper Don in the winter of 1943. 200,000 men sent east to hold a river line for Hitler. In 15 days, the Soviet Voronezh Front took that army apart. The 12th of January to the 27th. That was all it took. When the counting was done, more than 8 in every 10 of those men were dead, wounded, or in Soviet hands. 200,000 went east. About 40,000 ever saw Hungary again. This is how the Red Army did it. Why the Hungarian line was already doomed before the first shell fell. And who paid the bill for a decision made in Budapest? First, the army, because most people watching have never heard of it. Germany turned on the Soviet Union in 1941. Hungary followed its powerful ally into the war. At first, Budapest sent only a small force. In the spring of 1942, German pressure changed that. Hungary committed a full field army to the Eastern Front. That was the Second Army. 200,000 men moved east by rail through the summer. By autumn, they were dug in along the Don, southwest of the city of Voronezh. They were sent to do a first-rate job with third-rate tools. Hold on to that. The Second Army had almost no modern anti-tank guns. And the anti-tank gun was the one weapon that decided whether a defender lived or died against Soviet armour. What they had were light field guns. Those guns could not stop a T-34. That was the Soviet medium tank, and its sloped armour shrugged off the small rounds the Hungarians fired at it. Their own tanks were worse. The main one was the Panzer 38, a Czech-built machine. It had been useful in 1940. By 1943 it was outdated, its gun and armour both too light to trade blows with a T-34. Around it were weaker vehicles still. The light Toldi, a thin-skinned scout tank. Armoured cars called Saba. A handful of Nimrod anti-aircraft mounts pressed into service against ground targets. The one modern piece was tiny. About 10 German Panzer. 4 tanks carried the long gun. They alone could meet a T-34 on even terms. 10 tanks. To hold a 100-mile front. Most of the infantry did not ride to war. They walked, or they rode in horse carts, the way soldiers had moved 100 years before. Many were reservists, older conscripts, pulled from farms and towns. They got brief training, then a train 1,000 miles from home. Even the train was not safe. Soviet aircraft hit the transports on the way east. 19 of them were struck before the men reached the front at all. That front had already drunk their blood once. Through the summer and autumn of 1942, the Second Army was thrown against the Don bridgeheads again and again. The goal was to push the Soviets off the western bank. The village of Uryv alone cost 3 separate battles. Each one bled the Hungarians for ground they could not keep. When the smoke cleared, the Soviets still held their footholds at Uryv and at Shchuchye. The Second Army had spent its strength and most of its best men trying to take them back. So the army that faced January was already worn thin. It had traded its readiness away in the autumn. And it had traded it away over the exact 2 doorways the Red Army would later kick down. Inside that army was a second group of men who were not soldiers at all. Hungary had stripped its Jewish citizens of the right to carry a weapon. So tens of thousands of Jewish men were conscripted anyway into unarmed labour battalions and sent to the front to dig and haul. In the spring of 1942, some 50,000 Jewish men were called up into the Hungarian labour service. They were shipped into occupied Soviet territory to support the Second Army. Their first job was the roads. They built roads across the muddy fields, so the army's guns and carts could reach the Don. Once the fighting started, they carried ammunition forward to the firing lines. Unarmed. Under the same shell fire as the soldiers. With nothing to answer it. Their treatment was its own atrocity. Their own officers withheld their rations. They were denied boots and coats in a Russian winter. Men were made to stand outside without shelter. There are accounts of guards dousing them with water in the cold so that it froze on them where they stood. The cruelty was deliberate. More than 40,000 of these labour servicemen died on the Eastern Front. One who lived was a Budapest stockbroker named György Bayfeld, 40 years old, a trained lawyer, a gifted artist. He filled an album with paintings and notes of what he saw. His record survived the war. Most of the men around him did not. That was the force. Now the ground. The Second Army held a stretch of the Upper Don more than 100 miles long. Far too wide for the men and guns it had. And there was a flaw in that line that decided everything. 2 footholds sat on the western bank of the Don, left over from the fighting of 1942. 2 bridgeheads the Hungarians had bled to take and never cleared. One near Uryv, one near Shchuchye. From the outside they looked like small dents in the line. They were not dents. They were 2 loaded guns pressed against the Hungarian chest. 2 places where the Red Army was already across the river and waiting. Then came the cold, and the cold was an enemy of its own. Winter set in. The Second Army's supply system broke down. Trains and trucks could not keep the front fed. Frontline units went without the basics. No food. No fuel. No winter clothing. Men who had marched east in summer uniforms now faced a brutal Russian January in the open. The temperature on that front reached 30 below. Then 40. At 40 below, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Engines will not start. Oil turns to sludge. A man who lies down to rest may not get up. And these men were told to hold longer and longer stretches of frozen ground. Starving. Half-clothed. While the German command drained strength from the flanks to feed the fighting deeper east. That fighting deeper east was Stalingrad. And Stalingrad is the key to the timing. By January, the German Sixth Army was trapped in the ruins of that city. Surrounded. Dying by the day. To seal that trap and widen it, the Soviets went after the weak Axis armies guarding the German flank. The Romanians were overrun in November. In December, in an operation called Little Saturn, the Italian 8th Army on the Don was broken. That left one major Axis flank force still standing on that river. The Hungarian Second Army. It was next. The Soviet plan was simple. Smash it. Unhinge the whole German southern front. Open the road west. The operation had a name. Ostrogoth's Rossosh. The Red Army that came for them was not the beaten force of 1941. This was the Voronezh Front, under General Philip Golikov. It had learned how to break a line. The method was concentration, not pushing everywhere at once. Instead, the Soviets massed men, guns and tanks at a few chosen points and hammered until something gave. The Hungarians were spread thin across 100 miles. The Soviets stacked overwhelming force onto a few short stretches. At the point of contact, it was not army against army. It was a fist against a fingertip. And they already knew where to punch. The two bridgeheads the Hungarians had never cleared. From those footholds, the attack would drive inward and link up behind the defenders. Not push them back. Pocket them. Whole Hungarian corps sealed off, not driven off. A German formation sent to stiffen the flank, the 24th Panzer Corps, was caught in the same trap and crippled with them. When a defence breaks this way, the front does not bend. It shatters into islands. Each one surrounded. Each one told to hold ground that no longer connects to anything. It opened the 12th of January 1943. Out of the Uryv bridgehead, the Soviet 40th Army came against the Hungarian light divisions holding Matsek. At first it was reconnaissance in force. A probe, feeling the frozen line for its thinnest point. The next day, the full weight came down. A massed artillery barrage tore the forward positions apart. Then infantry and armour pushed out of the bridgehead into the gap. The Hungarian defenders had the wrong weapons, and too few of them. Their light guns could not stop the Soviet tanks. Where a single, heavy anti-tank gun might have held a road, there was nothing. So the tanks rolled through. The second blow landed a day later, in the south, out of the Shchuchye bridgehead. A reinforced Soviet rifle corps drove into the seam where the Hungarians met their neighbours. the seam gave way. The Italian units to the south came apart. With the flank open, the whole Hungarian front began to fold from the edges inward. There was a third arm to the plan, and it was the one that turned a breakthrough into a trap. From farther south, a Soviet tank army drove northwest behind the Hungarian rear. Its target was the force coming out of the northern bridgehead. When those pincers closed, they sealed the bulk of the Second Army and the German corps beside it inside two large pockets. The towns were Ostrogozhsk and Rossosh, the names the whole offensive would carry. Inside those pockets were the roads the army needed to escape on, and the supply dumps it needed to live on. Both now sat behind Soviet lines. The men who had held the river became the men surrounded in the snow, their backs to nothing. This is the moment the line stopped being a line. Within 2 days of the main assault, the Red Army had punched clean through at both ends. It was driving into the rear now, toward the roads, the supply dumps, the headquarters. 15 Axis divisions on that front were routed outright. 6 more were crippled. As an organised fighting force, the Hungarian Second Army had ceased to exist by the middle of the month. The dying went on for weeks. Here is the second betrayal, the one that turned a defeat into a catastrophe. The Hungarian units needed to fall back before they were surrounded. That is what a broken front demands. An orderly withdrawal to a new line. The German command above them refused it. The order was to hold. Stay and fight in place. In some sectors, to the last man. The Germans would not release their own reserves to relieve the Hungarians. And they would not let the Hungarians save themselves by pulling back in time. So the men stayed. In the cold. In front of an army that was already behind them. When permission to retreat finally came, for many units it came too late. They were already cut off. Now picture the retreat, because this is where most of the 200,000 were lost. And not one death in that picture was chosen. Units that broke free of the pocket set out west on foot across the open steppe. Ahead lay more than 80 miles of frozen country. Little food or none. No shelter on the march. The same summer weight clothing they had worn since autumn. And over all of it, the 40 below cold. The greatest enemy of the Hungarian Second Army in those weeks was not the T-34. It was the temperature. Men fell out on the march. They did not rise again. Frostbite took the hands and feet of those who kept moving. The march became a frozen nightmare. Whole columns of exhausted men trailed west, harried by Soviet mobile units with no strength left to fight and barely enough to walk. One name stands for what the cold did. Lieutenant General Marcel Stomm, a Hungarian corps commander, lost both of his legs to frostbite on that retreat. Then the Soviets took him prisoner. A general officer near the top of the whole force came out of that winter without his legs. Whatever happened to a general happened many times over to the private soldiers below him. The reservists from the villages. The labour servicemen with no boots at all. And the men who suffered worst on that march were the ones Hungary had armed the least. the unarmed Jewish labourers, sent east with the fewest supplies, given the least protection, left with the smallest chance of walking home. While that happened on the roads, General Jany sat down and wrote his order. The 24th of January, his army coming apart around him. He issued a directive that opened by declaring the Second Army had lost its honour. And then he blamed the men. He told soldiers who were freezing and starving in the open, whose weapons could not stop the enemy's tanks, whose retreat had been forbidden until it was too late, that the fault was theirs, that they had thrown away their good name. It was a stunning thing to put on paper. The army had been handed a front too long to hold, tools too weak to hold it. No winter kit, no working supply line, no permission to save itself. And its own commander answered all of that by accusing it of cowardice. That order became the symbol of the whole disaster. The moment the men at the top turned on the men they had sent to die. And there is a coda to it that Jany surely hoped would be forgotten. Months later, in the spring, the survivors had straggled home. The truth of what happened was plain by then. So Jany reversed himself. He issued a new order that withdrew the first one. It acknowledged that the Second Army had done its duty, that the blame he had cast was wrong. He took the word back. But a word like that, written in the middle of a catastrophe and read out to a broken army, is not undone by a second piece of paper. The men had already heard what their general thought of them at the worst hour of their lives. Now, the arithmetic, because the numbers are the verdict, and they are grim. The Second Army went to the Don with 200,000 men, plus the tens of thousands of Labour servicemen tied to it. In the fighting and the retreat that January, 100,000 of them died or went missing. 35,000 were wounded. 60,000 were taken prisoner, and captivity was its own long death. Prisoners were marched to the rear in the same cold that had broken them in the field, then held in camps far to the east. A large share of the men taken that winter never came home at all. Add it together. The casualty rate runs to 84%. More than 8 of every 10 men the country sent were gone. Only 40,000 made it back to Hungary. It was the single worst defeat in Hungarian military history. And it happened in 2 weeks. News like that cannot be hidden for long. When it reached Hungary, it changed the country. Budapest had sent a whole army east and gotten back a fifth of it. Nearly every town had its missing men. The government tried to keep the scale quiet at first. But a wound that size does not stay quiet. The shock of the Don broke something in Hungary's appetite for the war. From that winter on, the men around the region, Miklos Horthy, began a desperate search for a way out of the alliance that had cost them so much. That search for an exit is part of what led Germany, a little over a year later, to occupy Hungary outright and seize direct control. With all the catastrophe that followed for the Hungarian people, and above all for the Hungarian Jews. The road that ran through the Don ran on into darker country still. Step back and see what those 2 weeks brought the Soviets. because the Hungarian Second Army did not fall alone. It was one of 3 Axis flank armies the Red Army took off the board that winter. The Romanians in November, the Italians in December, the Hungarians now. With the Hungarian front gone, the entire left shoulder of the German position in southern Russia stood open. The Voronezh Front, having broken the Hungarians, rolled on more than 80 miles to the west and set up the next blows. Toward Voronezh, toward Kostoye, toward Kharkov. The trapped German 6th Army in Stalingrad surrendered on the 2nd of February. The destruction of the Hungarian Second Army was one of the hinges that whole southern collapse turned on. This is the part left out of the way most people picture Stalingrad, which stops at the city itself. The German disaster on the Volga was made total by the ruin of Hitler's allies on the rivers to the west. And the Hungarians on the Don were the largest of those allied forces to fall. Be honest about what this was and what it was not. Hungary's leaders had marched their country into a war against a giant, on the side of a regime that would, the very next year, occupy Hungary itself and deport hundreds of thousands of its people to their deaths. The men of the Second Army were sent to do that regime's work on the Don. Many were unwilling. Many were conscripts. And the Jewish labourers among them were victims twice over, forced east by the state and then abandoned in the snow. There is no clean side in a foreign army sent to hold a line for Berlin. But there is a plain truth in what happened to these men. They were used, badly equipped, then blamed. The Soviet Voronezh Front supplied the force that broke them. Their own high command, and the German command above it, supplied the conditions that made the scale of it certain. Which brings us back to Georgy Bayfeld, the stockbroker with his paint and his album. He was one of the few who lived. And because he lived and kept his record, we can still see the Labour battalions in his pictures, hauling ammunition through the mud toward the front. The men the Hungarian state counted for nothing. Most of the Labour servicemen sent to that front did not come home. Neither did most of the soldiers. Out of the whole force that went to the Don, only that 1 man in 5 came back. And here is the thing Gusztav Jany could not take back with a second order. He told the Second Army it had lost its honour. But that army had held a river line more than 100 miles wide, with obsolete guns, in 40 below cold, with no coats and no food, against a Soviet offensive aimed at exactly its weakest points, and forbidden by its own allies to save itself until it was too late. The honour that was lost on the Don was not the soldiers. It belonged to the men who sent them there. And it was gone long before the first Soviet gun opened fire.